Okay, let's unpack this. Have you ever thought about something so common, so everyday that it just sort of disappears until, suddenly you realize its story is actually fascinating and, well, pretty central to things like global health and safety. Today, our deep dive is into the global disposable glove market. Might sound a bit niche, maybe,
Yeah, maybe at first glance.
but it's actually a really crucial indicator of some massive global trends. So our mission here is to pull out the most important bits of knowledge from our source material, that's a report by Cognitive Market Research, to really understand this huge growth and what's behind it.
And what's really striking, I think, isn't just that gloves are essential now, but how their journey reflects these big shifts in how we think about hygiene, about contagion. Like, think back to the HIV/AIDS epidemic in the 80s. That really pushed glove use way beyond just surgery.
Okay, so that was a key moment.
A huge moment. It kind of set the stage, making them a baseline safety tool in a way they hadn't been before. And that groundwork, it paved the way for the hyper-hygiene conscious world we're sort of in now. So these gloves, whether they're nitrile, latex, vinyl, even neoprene, they're absolutely vital now for infection control, obviously, but across so many areas.
Like what specifically?
Well, healthcare is the obvious one, but also food processing, tons of industrial uses, and even just, people using them at home more.
Right, right. And the scale of this market, it's actually pretty surprising when you see the numbers. Cognitive Market Research found the global market was worth just over $10 billion in 2021.
10 billion for disposable gloves. It's quite something.
It is. And it's not slowing down. It's projected to hit nearly $13.8 billion by 2025.
Yeah.
But here's the really eye-opening part. They expect it to nearly double from there, hitting over $26 billion by 2033.
Wow, doubling again.
Yeah, that works out to a compound annual growth rate, a CHER, of about 8.36%.
Over 8% growth year on year for a decade. That's really strong, sustained growth.
It absolutely is. It definitely makes you stop and think. So looking at this, massive growth, what are the main things driving it? What's pushing that acceleration?
Well, if we try to connect this to the bigger picture, it's not random. It's really a mix of powerful forces coming together. You've got this generally heightened awareness about hygiene globally. People are just more conscious.
Post-pandemic effect, partly.
Definitely amplified by the pandemic, but the trend was there before too. Then you add regulatory mandates, more rules about safety in workplaces.
Okay.
Critical lessons learned from pandemic preparedness, that's a big one too. Countries and industries wanting to be ready. And just a steady increasing demand from industry generally across lots of different sectors.
It's coming from multiple angles.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's interesting where the growth is strongest. You have North America and Europe, right? They have strong baseline demand. That's largely because of, well-established healthcare systems, strict food safety rules, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Sure, the mature markets.
Right. But the real momentum, the really high growth rates, that's coming from emerging economies.
Okay. Whereabouts?
We're seeing really impressive, double-digit KGs in places like the Asia-Pacific region and South America.
Double digits. Wow.
Yeah. It signals a pretty significant global shift, suggesting health and safety priorities are really rising everywhere.
It's incredible, isn't it, how a product that seems so simple, so disposable, can actually mirror these huge global changes in health, safety, economics.
Mm-hmm. It's a real barometer in a way.
It really is. And maybe, for you listening, here's something to chew on. As this demand for disposable gloves just keeps rocketing upwards all around the world, what kind of profound shifts might we start seeing down the line? Think about manufacturing, who makes them, where, how, or material science. Are we going to see new glove materials emerge?
That's a great point. Innovation in materials is key.
And maybe the biggest question, waste management. What do we do with billions upon billions more gloves being thrown away each year?
It's a sustainability angle.
Yeah, it really raises some important questions about the long-term consequences of this essential yet ultimately disposable piece of safety equipment. Something to think about.
All right. Think about something you probably use without much thought. Something really common. A disposable glove. But have you ever stopped to consider the huge global industry behind that simple item? It's actually way more complex than you'd guess. Today, we're doing a deep dive into the surprisingly vital, sometimes pretty volatile, and definitely evolving disposable glove market. Yeah, it's much more than just, a box sitting in your doctor's office.
Exactly. And what's really interesting for this deep dive is our source material. We're looking at excerpts from a report called The Disposable Glove Market, Trends and Challenges.
Oh.
Our goal here is really to pull out the key insights, what's driving the market, the big obstacles it's facing, and where things seem to be heading. And I think some of the forces at play might genuinely surprise you.
Okay, so let's unpack this. How did this humble disposable glove become such a cornerstone of global trade? The report suggests it's really tied into these huge shifts in, well, how we live and work and stay healthy. Let's start with the most obvious thing, the constant global demand, which is directly linked to the massive growth in healthcare. We're talking about aging populations, more chronic diseases, plus just increased glove use everywhere, hospitals, surgery, labs, even dentists because of stricter infection control rules.
Right, and it's not just steady growth, is it? The report really highlights the post-COVID impact. It's not just about the crisis itself, it's about these long-term changes, like governments and institutions actually stockpiling PPE now. Gloves are essential emergency reserves.
Oh, so it's become institutionalized.
Pretty much. And that changes the baseline demand,
Yeah.
creates a more stable, higher floor for glove makers. It's shifted thinking from just-in-time inventory to just in case. Plus, the report mentions government investments, especially in developing regions like Asia-Pacific and Latin America. That's speeding up glove use in both public and private healthcare there.
That makes sense. So the healthcare demand is clear, but here's where it gets really interesting according to the report. The demand from outside healthcare. We're seeing a huge contribution from places like food processing, pharma, chemicals, even electronics manufacturing. And a lot of that seems to be driven by stricter industrial hygiene standards globally.
Yeah, absolutely. And that regulatory push, it's a massive market shaper. It's not just about ticking boxes. Think about agencies like OSHA in the U.S., setting workplace safety standards, or the FDA, the EU's EN standards for product performance. They're mandating glove use in all sorts of settings.
So that creates predictable demand?
Huge predictable demand. We're talking large-scale buying of nitrile, vinyl, polyethylene gloves, each suited for different things like chemical resistance or just cost in big industrial countries. Germany, China, the U.S., it's a really significant growing segment.
Okay, and then there's us, the consumers. The report talks about a big shift in our behavior too, right?
Definitely. COVID kind of normalized gloves for everyday things.
Yeah.
Grocery shopping, cleaning, caregiving.
Right, I remember seeing that everywhere for a while.
Exactly. And even though maybe the panic buying stopped, gloves became much more accessible. Think online platforms, Amazon, Alibaba.
Yeah.
Plus, private labels, bulk packs, they've sort of become a regular household item, especially in cities. It really broadened the market.
Maybe you've even found yourself grabbing a box for home. I know I have.
Oh,
Yeah.
Okay, so demand is booming from all sides. But what does this all mean? This kind of rapid growth rarely comes without problems. The report definitely points out some significant challenges and restraints the market is facing. Let's get into those.
Yeah, the first big one is raw material volatility. It sounds kind of standard, but the report stresses how much it hits this market specifically. You've got this really tricky mix of global oil prices affecting synthetics like nitrile and PVC, plus the weather impacting rubber plantations, mainly in Southeast Asia.
Ah, okay.
And then you layer on geopolitical trade stuff. It all makes production costs really unstable. Forecasting becomes a nightmare,
And that squeezes manufacturers.
especially the smaller ones. They often lack the supply chain resilience, the scale, to really absorb those price swings like the big players can. Margins get tight.
That sounds like a shaky foundation. Does the report mention any ways manufacturers are trying to cope, like hedging or maybe new materials?
Hedging exists, yeah, but it's tough to fully insulate. The report suggests the focus is more on diversifying supply sources and R&D into alternative materials, but that takes time and money.
Okay, so volatility is one thing. What else?
Environmental concerns. This is a big one. A lot of these gloves, especially nitrile and vinyl, they're just not biodegradable. They end up creating huge amounts of industrial and medical waste.
Right, the hygiene benefit has a waste downside.
Exactly. It's a paradox. And people are becoming more eco-conscious. Regulators, particularly in Europe and North America, are pushing for recyclable or compostable options.
But those aren't taking off yet.
Not really in the mass market. They're still quite a bit more expensive, and maybe performance isn't always identical yet. So widespread adoption, it's slow.
Okay, so cost and materials. What about getting the gloves where they need to go? Supply chains.
That's the other major vulnerability highlighted. Think about where most gloves are actually made.
Malaysia, Thailand.
Exactly. Malaysia, Thailand, China production is heavily concentrated there. So any disruption, labor shortages, export bans like we saw during COVID, shipping delays, it can destabilize global supply almost instantly, and prices shoot up.
It sounds incredibly fragile. Did the report mention any examples?
It did. There was an instance during the peak of COVID where a lockdown in just one Malaysian district caused glove prices to jump over 500% in some places. Just shows how dependent the world is.
Wow. So are governments trying to build local manufacturing?
There's talk, yes.
Hmm.
Some governments are exploring it, but the report notes progress is slow. Setting up these production facilities is really capital intensive. It's not a quick fix.
So despite these pretty serious hurdles, costs, environment, supply chains, the market is still evolving. The report also points to some key trends shaping the future, right? Let's shift focus there.
Absolutely. And one of the biggest trends is the move away from latex gloves. It's accelerating, primarily because of latex allergies. That's a major driver. But also nitrile just offers better chemical resistance for many uses.
So nitrile is winning out.
Nitrile and other synthetics, yeah. We're also seeing vinyl and TPE gloves gaining ground,
Yeah.
especially for non-medical stuff, where maybe super high durability isn't the top priority. You see this shift most clearly in North America and Europe, where regulations and just, well, customer preference are pushing towards latex-free.
Interesting. What about how the gloves are actually made? Any changes there?
Oh yeah, technology in manufacturing is a huge trend. Automation is really changing the game on production lines. The report talks about leading manufacturers, especially in Asia, pouring money into smart factories.
Smart factories, what does that involve?
Things like robots stripping gloves off the molds, AI doing quality control checks, IoT systems monitoring the whole process. It boosts efficiency massively, cuts down on the need for manual labor, which can be unreliable, and lets them produce gloves much faster. Helps meet that huge demand we talked about.
That makes sense. Faster, more consistent production.
Exactly. And then there's how the gloves are sold. That's changing too. E-commerce and private labels are really shaking up the traditional distribution channels.
So buying online.
Yep. Online marketplaces like Amazon, Alibaba, they now handle a big chunk of sales, especially to smaller clinics, independent caregivers, even just regular people buying for home use. And you're seeing new models emerge too, like subscription boxes for gloves or companies using influencer marketing. It's opening up the market for smaller or newer players.
It's a completely different way of reaching customers.
Totally, bypassing the old business-to-business route sometimes.
Okay, and what about the big companies, the competitive landscape? The report mentions some key players, names like Ansell, Top Glove, Hartalega, Kusan Rubber, Supermax, Honeywell, 3M, Kimberly-Clark, Protective Industrial Products. Quite a few big names there.
Yeah, it's a concentrated market, but still dynamic. Those leaders are definitely not standing still. They're actively expanding, developing new products, acquiring smaller companies, forming strategic partnerships to strengthen their positions globally.
So how are they dealing with all those pressures we talked about, the cost, the environmental concerns?
Well, according to the report, they're tackling them head-on, investing in R&D for things like biodegradable materials, more sustainable packaging. They're also diversifying their own supply chains, making them more resilient, and embracing digital transformation, especially lessons learned from COVID. It seems their financial performance reflects this strategic adaptation. They're navigating the pressures while trying to position themselves for the future. It's quite strategic.
So let's wrap this up. This deep dive really shows how something as, well, as simple seeming as a disposable glove sits right at the intersection of huge global forces. You've got healthcare needs, hygiene standards, consumer habits driving demand, but then wrestling with raw material costs, environmental impact, and these really fragile supply chains.
It really does. And it leaves us with a big question, doesn't it? As the world keeps prioritizing health, safety, and increasingly environmental responsibility, how is that ongoing tension going to keep reshaping industries like this one? What kinds of innovations and materials or processes are just around the corner that might solve some of these really complex trade-offs?
That's definitely something to think about. So maybe the next time you find yourself reaching for a disposable glove, you'll remember this conversation. Remember the intricate global story behind that thin layer of protection.